Hi, I'm Ernest and this is Strathmore Artist Paper's Back to Basics workshop. I'm going to start off by introducing you to the paper that we're going to be using today. For this project, I'm going to be using the Strathmore Tone Gray paper. It's a Series 400, particularly nice paper. Has a very nice surface, very heavy paper, and a very strong surface. So it'll take lots of mark making and can handle pretty much any kind of erasure that you might have to do with it. It also has some really gorgeous little fibers that run through the paper. So you've got an overall neutral gray on this. It's also available in a tan. For today's project, we're going to be using color pencils. Instead of black, I've decided to use indigo blue. I'm also using white, and again, I'm using both a hard version of it to maintain that point and the soft version for broader areas. And then as my insurance policy in today's drawing, I'm also going to be using oil pastels. With the oil pastels, I'm using a white to pair up with the white color pencils and an indigo blue to pair up with the dark color pencils. These I reserve for the very end of the drawing. If I run out of pressure with the whites or with the indigo blue and color pencils and can't achieve those last highlights or those last core shadows, I can switch over to this to really make the drawing pop. Okay, before we get started with today's project, I'm going to take just a little bit of time to talk with you again about lighting. Right now we have the subject illuminated by natural lighting coming in from a window on the right hand side from above and to the right. We have an overcast day outside, so the light is rather bluish gray in nature. We're going to supplement that now with an in-studio light. This light is a warm incandescent. See immediate change to it. We'll give the camera just a moment to adjust the white balance to that light, and you see we get a much stronger light over on the right hand side of our subject, and our shadow over on the left side of the subject has become much darker as well, increasing the contrast. We want increased contrast if we're developing a form, because the greater the contrast between lights and darks, the easier it is to show that form. But you notice now that perhaps the shadows are a little bit too dark on the left hand side. So what I'm going to do now is bring in a reflector. I'll bring it into the image so that you can see it. It's just a white sheet of paper, heavy stock. In fact, it's Strathmore watercolor paper, perfect for this purpose. And by reflecting a little bit of the artificial light from our source on the right into the shadow on the left, we see just a little bit more of the form and a little bit more of the detail in the shadow over on the left hand side. So that's what we're going to actually use in lighting for our subject today. Irregardless of your subject matter that you choose to work with for this project, explore the possibilities of the lighting, see what will happen with it. Right now I'm moving the shadow, or rather the reflector, down underneath the subject, and you see as I rotate it back up to the left, I can actually get varying lighting effects in here. Explore those possibilities. That's another one of your creative options. As with our previous lessons, I'm going to start off by setting my composition wheel to the same proportions as our sheet of paper. Make a decision about whether I'm going to use it horizontally or vertically. And to help me with this decision, I'm going to, of course, start by looking through the viewfinder. I can, in order to come up with my composition, I can try different options with this device. By moving it closer to my eye, I see more of my subject. By moving it farther away, I see less of the subject. I can try horizontal position and vertical. I can move it slightly to the left, slightly to the right, slightly up or down, and come up with my different options. When I finally come up with the one that I like, take a moment to notice where the compositional frame is overlapping the shirt, the chest, and the arm, and then we're ready. During the blocking in stage, instead of using the softer pencil. I'm using a very thin pencil, which is a pencil that has a harder lead, maintains a finer point for longer, and makes a lighter mark. We want to use marks that are dark enough that we can see them, but light enough that we can erase them if we need to. We're at the stage where we're checking measurements of the components against one another, checking to make sure that proportions are evenly measured, that they're equal to one another where they need to be. And when we need to do erasing, this paper, this toned paper, takes erasure very, very well. Now don't be alarmed if with your white eraser, if it picks up, if you're using something like the indigo blue, it may actually pick up some of that blue during the erasing. That's the job that it has for us. And don't worry about putting pressure on this paper. This paper is formulated specifically to take quite a bit of erasing so that we can erase right back down to the tone of the paper without doing any damage whatsoever. Once you've made a correcting mark, go ahead and erase the original error. This will help you to avoid the temptation at this stage of getting too dark. If you've got 2, 3, 4 marks in there, the temptation is going to be to make the correct one darker so that it will stand out. Don't do that at this point. We still want to continue to make measurements, and then check to see if indeed those are accurate. If they are, we keep them. If they're not, we make changes to them. And we'll continue this phase until all of our measurements come in the way that we want them to be. If we find an error, we'll correct it. Okay, at this point we have completed the underdrawing of our subject. I've checked and double-checked proportions, positions, scale, and so forth, position of different parts of the face to one another, checked their overall measurements against the subject, and so on. And I've marked those a little bit darker than my original blocking in gesture, but you'll notice that it's still a good distance away from my darkest tone. I do that because I want to reserve the darkest darks for the very end of the drawing. This way, if there's anything that I discover is still off as far as proportions and positions and so forth, or shape is concerned, I can make adjustments to those, and it's still going to be relatively easy for me to make erasures if I need to move a line over, for example. If you remember back to lessons 1, 2, and 3, I made mention of the idea of building on what we already know, building on a foundation of what we already know. We're going to be continuing that in the 4th and final lesson here, but for the first time we're also going to temper that. We are going to moderate what we know. And by that I mean the majority of our drawing up to now, in fact all of our drawing in the first 3 lessons, has been on white paper. For most of us, the majority of our drawing experience is indeed on white paper, and we're used to using the tone of the paper to represent our highlights, and then we move gradually toward our darkest darks as we move into the drawing. We, however, want the tone of the paper, the middle tone, to actually represent middle tone. And the reason for that, as you discovered in lesson 2 and lesson 3, is that the majority of our time when we're doing a tonal drawing with pencil, the majority of our time is actually spent in getting rid of the white of the paper. In fact, the majority of both of our previous drawings, the drawing 2 or the lesson 2 and the lesson 3 drawing, was a middle tone. If we use the tone of the paper, that means that in this drawing the majority of the finished tone is already here. It's provided by the paper. So we're going to try to reserve as much of the paper tone for the drawing, and we're going to put as little onto that as possible, and let's keep it that way. Our next step, what we're going to do is we're going to make a conscious move to remember that the paper is a middle tone. And so for a moment I'm going to set down my dark pencil, something that we didn't do at all when we were working on white paper. And now I'm going to move over to a light pencil, to the white, and I'm going to start very gently blocking in some of those highlight areas. You'll notice though that I'm working with the pencil held back at the back, and the reason for that is that I want to keep a light pressure on this. I want the pressure on this to be as light as possible. I want it to be bold enough that I can see it, but faint enough that I can erase it if I put something in and then suddenly come to the realization that that doesn't work, that what I thought was a light was maybe a middle tone, for example. Again, don't rush yourself on this stage. This is where we want to start discovering things about our subject. A reminder about working with color pencils. Color pencils are either wax-based or oil-based, depending on the manufacturer, and they generally tend to be much softer than our graphite pencils. So you're going to lose that point on the pencil, and the point is what gives us detail. So if you can, do what I'm doing. You'll notice, if you're watching the writing on the pencil, you'll notice that it comes into view from time to time as I'm working, and then it disappears. The reason for that is that every few strokes I'm rotating a little bit between my fingers. Another reason for using a light application at this stage is it allows me to go all the way out to the outside edge of the form initially. But as I start working the form up, as I get bolder and bolder with these lights, I'm going to move them away from my edge, because what's happening is the form is actually turning and moving away from us at these outside edges. So I don't want to, if I can avoid it, I don't want to end up with really bold tones right at the outside edge. As I've said previously, bold tones, whether they're light or dark, have a tendency to drop forward or jump forward in our drawings. So I want to really reserve those for the areas that are closest to us. A couple of other rules to keep in mind. We don't want to mix our light pencil and our dark pencil in this drawing. The reason? Well, if we mix a light and a dark, what we end up doing is creating a middle tone. And the middle tone, if all goes well, is going to be provided for us by the paper. So if we're mixing the two of them together, we're overworking our drawing. We're not letting the paper do its job. We've started putting enough of the white pencil in here now that you should be noticing by now that we're already seeing tone shifts. We're seeing a light to a dark tone shift. Obviously not a dark as in a shadow tone, but a darker tone, lighter to darker. Once we've established this, it assures us that we will be able to see the paper tone as one of our tones, as our middle tone. The only places in your drawing that a light tone and a dark tone should actually meet, that they should actually border on one another, is at the outside edge of a form where one form overlaps another form, in this case the hair overlapping the wall, for example, or the temple piece of the eyeglasses overlapping the face. There you could have a light meeting a dark. But with also, if you're doing a cubical form, if you've got one plane at one angle meeting another plane at another angle, right along the edge where those two meet, you could have a sharp edge. But within a turning form, and the face is a turning form. It's a cylindrical form, modified obviously. But what we want to do there is when we start introducing the dark tones, we want to make sure that the dark tones in this turning form are separated from the light tones within the turning form by a middle tone, each one blending one into the other. Okay, in putting in the initial highlights applications, again we're establishing that the tone of the paper is going to represent our middle tone. I'm using a hatching system for a couple of reasons. One, because the pencil itself is a linear tool, so this is the fastest and most effective way to use the pencil itself. But also it means that irregardless of how much pressure I'm putting on the pencil at this point, since I'm alternating lines with the tone of the paper, I know that I can get bolder. I can get a brighter light at any time simply by filling in more of those gaps between the lines that are already there. I'm also reserving a little extra pressure and a tool that I'll mention a little bit later on for the final stage of the drawing when I want to really pop those final highlights. The title of today's workshop is The Road Less Traveled. When I was a youngster, I was introduced to the poetry of Robert Frost, and I was particularly taken with his poem about the two roads and choosing the road less traveled. That's always been a favorite theme of mine in looking for subject matter, but it's also very appropriate to the paper that we're working with today. As you're going to see as we progress in this lesson, this is actually a very fast way to work up a tonal drawing, much faster than working on white paper. So it gives you an opportunity to complete a drawing more quickly. It frees you up to spend more time looking at the creative aspects and the observational aspects of the drawing instead of the technical aspect of just filling in the white of the paper. It's also interesting in that the majority, even though it is a faster technique than working on white paper with pencil, it's substantially less used. Far fewer people work with tone paper than with white paper. So if you are opting to work on tone paper, the likelihood is just the decision to work on tone paper is going to make your work stand out from the majority of others, given that they're going to choose to work on white. At this point, we've established the basic positions of our light tones. We've established that the paper is providing us with our middle tone. So now we're ready to switch back to our dark pencil. And as I mentioned earlier, we're working, instead of working with a black pencil, I chose just to try something a little bit different. So today we're working with an indigo blue, which is actually quite dark. On the video it may even be registering as black, but it's not. It's just a little bit different, a bit cooler than a standard black. Gives us a bit more variety. Again, I'm starting off with hatching. I can switch over to a more continuous tone later on, but I probably, even if I do switch to the continuous tone, it's going to be in more selective areas. Now, reminder, the only time that we want a dark tone to be right up against the light tone is where one form, in this case the eyebrow, meets another form, which is in this case the forehead, or where the line of the hair meets the temple and the line of the hair meets the background. And again, you notice that I'm working the pencil from the very back end of it. This allows me to make longer, straighter marks, and also helps me to avoid putting in too much pressure. Now, when I blocked in the initial position of and shape of the hair, I went ahead and put in a couple of light lines to represent some of the curls. And what I'm going to do initially in blocking this in is I'm going to leave that the tone of the paper. That'll help me to differentiate the highlight and the hair. But I won't use a light tone in there. The hair is dark, so even the lightest tone in there is not as bright as the flesh tones that we have in here. There are, however, shadows that are occurring. In the iris, I'm going to introduce a hatching. That does two things. One, it represents the actual muscle structure of the iris of the eye. If you get close up to a figure and look at it, you'll see that. And the other thing is, because it's an open pattern, without getting more pressure in it, I can then introduce a more solid tone, and that will give us the pupil. My subject has very dark, long eyelashes, so I'm just going to put in, but I'm going to go ahead and put in that tone, but I'm not going to put in individual hairs. Same thing with the brow. I'm not going to worry about that. I want the tone shift. Tones. Lights, darks, and middle tones. Highlights, core shadows. Those are probably second only to shape in importance in our work. Now notice that the temple of the glasses are dark compared to the color of the flesh areas here, but right here where there's a little bit of light reflecting off that temple, it's also lighter than the hair on either side, up or above it. I'm sorry, below or above it. One other thing that I did just a moment ago too is my initial blocking in, I had drawn in the shape of the glasses. As I was putting in the light tones in the flesh, I also noticed that the lens itself, because of the way it was ground, there was a highlight, not a particularly bold one, but a highlight reflecting off just beneath the dark frame of the glass. The glasses also have half frames. There's no frame down beneath the lens down here, and it was actually a light tone, so I went in and erased that line out, that initial line, and brought in a light tone instead. Remember, I want to avoid, wherever possible, I want to avoid mixing the two. So I erased out that outline before I put in the white. As I'm bringing in the hair, I'm noticing that the hair is darker than the flesh tones. It's also darker than the wall in the background for the most part, but there are highlights reflecting off of it. So I'm going to want to tone that. In the shirt, the face and neck are all casting shadows onto the left side of the shirt. So we have very little detail that's going on in there. In fact, what detail we do make out is actually a shift between dark and between shadow and core shadow. Over in this area, there are no middle tones or highlights. So I'm going to go ahead and start off by simply getting rid of the middle tone in here. This is going to be, even if I end up with some light tones in here, this is going to be one of those areas where I've got one form overlapping another form. The clothes overlapping the body. And therefore we can justify a crisp edge there. As we move over onto this side, we're going to end up with some reflected lights. But I noticed a couple of things. One, just underneath the collar on the back side here, we have a Nice little core shadow on the inside of the collar. And then we have a very interesting area where the collar of the shirt is actually casting a shadow on here. We want to look at this very carefully because although the shirt itself is dark to begin with, its local color is dark, it's a dark forest green kind of color, this area is still reflecting light both from the window and from the artificial light, the studio light that we're using. So we've got some light tone reflecting off of here, and although the local color is dark, it may be that the reflected color is actually lighter than this area we're in here. We've gradually built up our lightest lights and darkest darks, moving from the paper, the middle tone of the paper, toward our lightest lights, toward our darkest darks. We're pretty close to the last stage of our drawing, and we're quickly running out of intensity. We've pushed both the light and the dark pencil just about as far as they're going to be pushed. And if you're working exclusively in color pencil, this is probably going to be about as far as you'll want to push the drawing. Remember, as a general rule, the last boldest marks, whether the lights or the darks, should be in the area closest to you because those are the marks that are going to pop up. Like I said, if you are working in just color pencils, then this will probably be about as far as you're going to want to push it. But I've got a little insurance policy that I've held on to, and that's these right here, oil pastels. I have two of them that I'm going to be using today since we're doing monochromatic. I've got an indigo blue, which matches the indigo blue pencils that I'm using, and I've also got white. They're very soft, in fact much softer than the color pencils that we've been using, so I can go in knowing that I can put in just, and again I'm initially just softly putting that in, but I'm going to put it in a few spots where I want just a little bit of a pop to it. Now in the white of the eye, you have to be very careful about this. With the white of the eye, we know that part of the eye is, as the name implies, the white of the area, but that's the local color. The reflected color may not be the same. The eye is actually a curved form. Our light source is coming from this side, so this side of the white of the eye is a little bit lighter than that. So I'm going to take a little bit of the oil pastel and I'm going to go right up against the iris and pop that just a little bit. I'm going to come into the eyelid, the lower eyelid, and I'm going to put a little bit on the side of that where it's also reflecting light. I'm going to put a little bit on the highlight of the wing of the nose, a little bit on the lower lip where it's got a highlight in there, and a little bit right in the bony area of the cheek, right in here where the skin is the thinnest, right on top of the bone. The bone is nice and taut. I'm sorry, the skin is nice and taut, and therefore you have a nice strong reflection there. The upper edge of the ear where it just disappears behind the hair. That little bit of the ear right there, and that part of the earlobe. A few last marks to lock in our boldest tones, and we're done. Well, that wraps it up for our fourth and final lesson in the Back to Basics workshop. I hope you've enjoyed our time together as much as I have, and that I see you again real soon.